All right. So in this webinar, if you haven't joined any of our webinars before, the audio is only one way, so you can hear me, but I can't hear you. But if you'd like to ask any questions during the webinar, feel free to do so. We'll actually be doing screen sharing for most of it. So actually, there's a toolbar up at the top of the WebEx window, and you'll see a little icon to get to the Q&A box. So if you pull that up, you'll be able to type your question, and one of our Listen panelists can answer it for you during the session. And we'll also have a little Q&A section at the very end if you'd like to wait until then. So let's start with a rundown of the new features in SoundCheck 13. You may have received an email in our newsletter showing you the new features or seen them on our website. For the basic list, we've now included a new reformatted sequence editor that's much easier to use, a little bit more powerful. I'll be going through a demonstration showing you all the features in that. Along with the new sequence editor, we're introducing a series of debugging tools that will make it much easier to troubleshoot complex sequences. We're also adding new graphs, X, Y, and waveform graphs to SoundCheck 13. Again, trying to make them simpler, easier to use, a little bit more efficient. We've also made a number of memory management improvements. I'll go through what that means in terms of using SoundCheck 13. For the first time, we're introducing a 64-bit version of SoundCheck that we're excited about. So if you have a 64-bit OS for Windows, you will now be able to install the native 64-bit version of SoundCheck. We've also revamped our SoundCheck 1 product as part of the SoundCheck 13 release, and I'll go through and give you a quick demonstration of that as well. And a few small new improvements to version 13, a consolidated preferences menu where we've put together a bunch of different selections from SoundCheck and combined them into a single menu. We also have a new quick start menu as an easy way to navigate the system when you're first launching the program. And finally, memory list values for time window in the log TSR analysis step. So we'll go through these one by one, and for some of them I'll switch over and show them to you in SoundCheck. So first, the sequence editor reformat. So one of the main differences with the new sequence editor is that it runs in parallel with the rest of SoundCheck. What that means, if you've used previous versions of SoundCheck before, no longer will the sequence editor take focus away from the rest of SoundCheck. So now when the editor is open, you can actually click on things and use other windows like the main SoundCheck menu, work with your displays, and the sequence editor can remain open. The editor can actually even remain open while you are running a test sequence, which is very useful. So instead of having to open the editor, make changes, close it, and then run the sequence, you can now leave the editor open all the time, which makes your test development a lot more efficient. So you can make changes to the sequence, see what the result is by running the test, and keep going back and forth and modifying. If you run the sequence while the editor is open, we'll also show you with a little highlighting which step is currently running. So you can actually watch the flow of the test sequence as it goes through, monitoring which step is running at different times, keep track of things like the logic, the looping, and watch the whole flow of the sequence. When the sequence editor is open, you can actually now access the main SoundCheck menu, which allowed us to get rid of some redundant menus that we had in the sequence editor previously and make it a little bit more cleaner and more efficient to use. Because the editor can remain open while you're working with the rest of SoundCheck, you can actually move the sequence editor to a second monitor. So if you're running a dual monitor setup, in this way you could have the editor open all the time on a second monitor and then save your other monitor to devote to the full SoundCheck window and to view your displays and data and so forth. We've switched to a more compact design with the sequence editor. We were able to do that by removing a lot of the tools that were on there before. One of the things we changed in the step template pane on the left side, instead of having it broken down into different categories that you switch between, we've now made it into a tree structure, so you have access to all the different categories simultaneously. I'll show you an example of that in a second. This entire step template pane can actually be collapsed. So if you want to devote the entire width of the sequence editor to just the sequence that you're currently working with, you can actually close down the step template pane entirely. One of the main focuses with creating this new sequence editor was making it easier to use. So we made some nice little improvements in the way that you work with the editor. First, drag and drop functionality. So this allowed us to get rid of a lot of the buttons that you had to click on before to insert steps, to reorder the steps within the sequence. Now instead of doing that, you simply use drag and drop functionality, which is very intuitive, easy to figure out. So to add a step to the sequence, you just grab a template from the step template library, drag it into the sequence. And similarly, to reorder the steps within the sequence, you simply grab, drag, and drop. We've also moved a lot of functions that previously were only available in the main sequence editor menu into the right-click menus. So therefore, you don't have to move the cursor around a lot to get to the different functions and hunt around for them. A lot of things are available for easy access just by right-clicking in the sequence editor. And finally, a very big improvement for people that are developing a lot of test sequences is the undo functionality. So if you insert the wrong step templates or make a change that you didn't intend to do, you reordered steps, a number of different items can be undone essentially. You right-click in the sequence or use Control-Z, and SoundCheck will remember a number of different functions that you've done, and you can go back and backtrack through all those changes that you've made. So it's very handy for those people who are developing a lot of sequences, especially doing a lot of different things with the sequence editor. Let me give you a quick demonstration of that here in SoundCheck. So here's the new sequence editor. As you can see, it's a lot cleaner interface overall. We don't have the menu at the top, and we don't have the buttons in the middle or at the bottom of the editor anymore. The left side is still the step template library, and all of the templates are broken down into their categories here in the tree structure. So you simply click the plus sign to expand a category and see all of the template files that are available in that category. To create some new templates or modify the ones you have, it's all available through a simple right-click menu. When you go to add steps to your sequence, simply select which template you would like and then drag it into the sequence. You'll see a black line indicating where the step is going to go, and once you drop it, the step appears there. Once the step is in your sequence, if you'd like to reorder, simply grab a step, and then you can move it to the new location. And as I said, all these functions can be undone. If you right-click, SoundCheck will tell you what the last operation was that you performed, in my case, moving a step. So I can undo the move step operation, right-click again, and now I can undo insert step, and I'm right back to where I was at the start. You can even now multiple select both step templates and steps within your sequence. So for example, if you wanted to add a number of different step templates simultaneously, you could control-click to select them here and then drag them all into your sequence. Similarly, in the sequence, you can use a shift-click to select a whole range of steps and then move them up or down, or say remove and delete a whole section of the sequence all at once. So the focus here is making it a lot simpler, easier to use, and I think you'll find that it's a lot more intuitive than the old sequence editor was. So along with the new sequence editor, we've introduced a series of debugging tools. First, a very simple one, but very useful, is any of the steps that can generate a pass-fail result, being messages, limits, and display steps, are highlighted in green or red on their step number to indicate a pass or a fail. So by having that visual indication in the sequence editor, if you leave the editor open while you're running the sequence, you can use that to debug any of the logic you might be doing. So for example, you may have a pass-fail that either loops back in the sequence or moves on. So by seeing that pass-fail indication here in the editor, you'll be able to check and make sure that the logic is doing what you expect it to do. We've also added breakpoints. The sequence editor is essentially a programming interface, and most programming interfaces allow some capability to put in a breakpoint or a pause at certain points. So now you right-click on a step and insert a breakpoint, and you'll see that little red dot that you see on the screenshot down there at the bottom. You can have as many breakpoints in the sequence as you desire, so if you have a very complex sequence, want to put in some pauses to check whether the sequence is working properly, you can add as many of them as you would like. When you run the sequence and it reaches a breakpoint, the sequence will essentially pause, and you'll see some new buttons up on the toolbar at the top. There's now a button for single step, which allows you to increment through the sequence one step at a time. And there's another button to continue from the breakpoint, where it will move on and run the rest of the sequence. With a combination of breakpoints and using these controls, you could actually run just a portion of the sequence. When you hit a breakpoint, you can edit steps, edit the sequence. You can view the memory list, look at data. So for example, if you wanted to put in a breakpoint, open up the step editor, make some changes, then you can have the sequence move on from there. So it's really very flexible. Lastly, we now include a Run From Here option available in the right-click menu. So if you want to start the sequence at some point other than the very beginning, if you right-click on a step, choose Run From Here, and then you can run just a portion of the sequence later on. So using that in combination with breakpoints really gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of debugging the sequence and breaking it down into smaller portions. Let me show you some of those options. So first of all, I can leave the sequence editor open while I run the sequence, and when I hit start, you'll see a yellow highlighting appear in the editor showing you which step is currently running. Now most of it happens very, very quickly, all of the analysis and limit steps and so forth. You probably didn't even see the yellow updating. But as you run through the sequence, you'll see it highlight each step as it goes, which gives you some tracking to show how the sequence works. Now if I wanted to introduce a breakpoint in the sequence, let's say I wanted to run the acquisition and then pause before the analysis. I can right-click on the step and choose Set Breakpoint. And now I see the little red dot appear next to the step. Now if I run the sequence, it runs the acquisition, and now it pauses before it runs the analysis step. We now get the two new buttons up here on the toolbar, the Step button and the Continue button. If I click Step, it will run the analysis step I'm currently on, and you see the new data gets produced. Now it's moved on in the sequence to the next step, and I can hit Step again, and now my impedance data has been generated. So you can continue through the sequence like that, one step at a time, or you can hit the Continue button or hit Enter on the keyboard, and it will go ahead and finish the rest of the sequence. The other thing we can do is right-click and choose the Run From Here option down below. So this will cause the sequence to start from this step rather than at the very beginning. So for example, if I wanted to just rerun all of my limit steps after making some changes, I can right-click, say Run From Here, and it simply runs that whole portion of the sequence without rerunning anything else. Now, a number of the step editors, when you open them up, have an Apply button. And this has been around in SoundCheck for a long time, and it allows you a way to run just that step. Well, previously, you always had to open up the step editor to do it, so if you wanted to step through a sequence, it could take you a while. Now we introduced that feature also from the right-click menu. So any step, if you want to rerun it, you can right-click and say Apply, and it will run just that one step all by itself. So moving on, I'd like to show you the new graphs that we have in SoundCheck 13. So the XY and the waveform graphs have been improved to give them a cleaner look and a more intuitive interface. So we've moved away from some of the graphical controls on the previous graphs and now moved to more right-click based menus, which are a little bit simpler to figure out. So you can right-click either in the main sequence window. You can also right-click on the X and the Y axes to make changes and select preferences. Also, there's a collapsible toolbar down at the bottom. If you click the double arrows, it will actually expand that toolbar without changing the size of the window, which gives you a few extra controls, things like an auto scale button and the delta for the two cursors. We've also taken the plot legend and moved it from the right side of the graph up to the top of the graph. And the reason for that is to maximize the graph space in terms of the width in the window. Previously, with the plot legend on the right side, if you had very long data names, it would start to compress the area devoted to the graph. So by having the plot legend at the top, you can have very, very long data names and still not lose out on any space. Now let me show you the new graph controls. I'm going to switch over to the offline tab for the moment here, and I'm just going to bring up a new XY graph, and we'll just do that by double-clicking on the fundamental. So here's my curve. Now if I want to make any modifications to this graph, for instance, if I want to set the X scale here, I can right-click on the X-axis and turn off auto-scaling. And now I can go in and type what I would like my graph range to be, maybe 20 to 20 kilohertz. Similarly, on the Y-axis, I can right-click, turn off auto-scale, and now set this to a custom range. If I expand the toolbar down here at the bottom by clicking the double arrows, I get access to some tools here, things like zoom controls, the hand control, and the arrow for controlling cursors. These functions are also available if you right-click in the main graph window. We have all those same options available right here. So it depends on what you like to work with, the toolbar down here at the bottom or the right-click menu. The right-click menu also contains a number of things that previously were available from the menu on the graph. So we've done away with the main menu that was there and moved them all into the right-click control. So if I wanted to re-auto scale, I have these two buttons here. So for example, if I added some more data to my graph, now I have some new data here, but I can't see it because it's off my graph. So if I wanted to just re-auto scale the Y-axis, I could re-enable auto scaling by right-clicking here. But if I just want to do a one-time auto scale, I can click the Y button down here. And now it re-auto scales to include all of my data. So if I want to work with any of the data here in the plot legend, I can use the arrow controls to click down and see all the different items that are currently being displayed and change their properties. Or I can change the width of this by clicking on the separator and dragging it down. So I can devote a little bit more space to my curves up here. So if I want to go in and change maybe the colors of these, that's not a very good color. Let's use a light blue. And then when I'm done with the plot legend, I can either collapse it back down, or if I click on the separator, it'll collapse entirely. And if you click it again to reopen it, it remembers the size. So if you have a number of items you want to be able to see, you could expand this far so you can set all of your preferences and then collapse it back down if you want to devote the full space to the graph. Now the cursor controls have been worked into the right-click menu. So if you right-click on a curve, you'll see cursor 1, cursor 2. And if you select cursor 1, we can say drop here. And so now my cursor appears. We get a label that shows us the name of the curve that it's attached to, as well as the X and the Y values. You can simply click and drag to move the cursor around to different points, and you can even just drag it over to different curves. It will lock onto them. If you want the second cursor, we can right-click, select cursor 2, and drop here. Now we have our two cursors visible at the same time. If I go back to my toolbar, you'll see the delta between the two. So at 200 hertz, where I have the cursors right now, the delta is 24 dB between the second and the third harmonic. Right-click can get you into the Preferences menu as well, which allows a number of different things like changing the way all the colors appear. You can change the background color if you prefer white backgrounds or gray, and we can also change the cursor colors here. So for instance, if I want to switch over to a gray cursor. And once you establish all the preferences that you like for your particular graph, from the memory list, you can always set those as the default so that any new XY graph you create comes up with your set of preferences that you like. In SoundCheck 13, we've made some significant improvements to memory management, specifically with the way that SoundCheck handles waveforms. So waveforms use far less memory than they did previously, which allows you to now use much longer stimulus signals than you could in earlier versions of SoundCheck. This is becoming a requirement, especially with people who are doing communications devices testing, where they want to play very, very long speech signals. So now in SoundCheck 13, with the improved memory management, you'll be able to play those longer signals. And in keeping with that theme, we're introducing SoundCheck 64-bit for the first time. One of the main advantages to having a 64-bit application is that we can address far more system RAM than we can with 32-bit. Having all of that extra RAM lets us do a couple of things. We can use even longer stimulus signals and handle more waveforms in general. So this opens up SoundCheck to working with really, really long stimulus signals and also for doing much larger multi-channel type testing. So the amount of waveforms that we can keep in memory is significantly increased. Another benefit of having the 64-bit and accessing the more RAM is that we can now open larger sets of data into the memory list for doing statistics, analysis, post-processing, reporting. So if you have large sets of production data you want to be able to analyze in SoundCheck, now you'll be able to do that using the 64-bit. SoundCheck 1 was first introduced as part of SoundCheck 9. You know, the naming can be a little confusing sometimes, but SoundCheck 1 is a separate product in some ways, targeted at low-cost, simple production measurement. And the original version was designed specifically for loudspeaker testing. Well, in the latest release here, as part of version 13, we've revamped the SoundCheck 1 product and added 2 new applications. SoundCheck 1 can now measure microphones as well as headphones. And of course, it retains its ability to test loudspeakers. So this was due to customer demand wanting the low-cost system to still be applicable to these other types of transducers. One of the differences with the new version of SoundCheck 1 is that rather than running in a custom interface designed specifically for SoundCheck 1, now it runs in the standard SoundCheck interface, which has a good benefit, which is if you learn how to use this interface and then decide to upgrade in the future to the full version of SoundCheck, nothing really changes. The whole interface stays the same, and so the knowledge transfers quite well. Another difference, instead of having a sequence generation tool like we did in the old version of SoundCheck 1, we now have sequence templates. So the templates are provided per application. You start with one of our templates, and then you can change all of the parameters that you'd like in the sequence, and then use Save As to generate your own new sequences. And you can create as many sequences as you want. They just all have to be based off the templates that are provided. Customizing these sequence parameters is much easier than before. So now you can modify things like stimulus parameter and frequency range very easily, modify limits, change the display, change what gets saved to disk. So all of these individual parameters can be adjusted in SoundCheck 1. The limiting factor, and why it's a lower cost system, is that you can't modify the sequence structure itself. So you can't change what steps are in the sequence, and you can't define the logic of the sequence. So you're fixed to the sequence template that is provided for generating all of your custom sequences. But sequences can be shared between SoundCheck 1 systems. So if you want to set up a production lab or a production line that has several different systems on it, all using SoundCheck 1, you can generate the sequences on one system, take the SQC file and copy it to the other systems, and then they can all be running exactly the same test scripts. SoundCheck 1 is still designed to be used with the Amp Connect hardware as it has been from the beginning, specifically now the Amp Connect ISC, the one with the built-in sound card. And that keeps the system very simple as well. You simply plug in one USB cable to your computer, and all of your transducers get plugged into the Amp Connect. So it's very easy to configure and set up. Let me give you a quick demonstration of SoundCheck 1. To do so, I need to switch which status.dat file I'm pointing to, because SoundCheck 1 is essentially a module as far as SoundCheck goes. And so if you have a status.dat file that has the SoundCheck 1 module enabled, it will switch over to this system. So we get a little visual indicator that we're in SoundCheck 1 mode, which is the background changes here. So SoundCheck 1 is part of the same installation as the full version of SoundCheck. We just switch over to this different mode. SoundCheck 1 cannot open sequences from a full version of SoundCheck. It can only open the sequences that were generated from SoundCheck 1 templates. So in SoundCheck 1, if we just go to File, Open, SoundCheck will automatically go to the SC1 folder, and now we can see the templates that are available. So we have a template for headphone testing, one for loudspeakers, one for microphones, and then there's another sequence here. If you're doing microphone testing, there's a sequence that helps you measure the response of your loudspeaker that you'll be using to measure the mic and account for it when you actually run the template sequence. So let's start with the loudspeaker sequence. I'll show you this just as a simple demo. So if we open our template, we can actually open the sequence editor and see the sequence, but it's all disabled here. We can't actually make any changes to the test sequence, as I said before. It's a locked template. But if you wanted to keep this open to view the sequence while you're running, you can. So let me run the sequence here once, just to generate some data. And then I'll show you how you can modify the parameters. So as you can see, there's a bunch of stock limits in here that are just flat lines, essentially. So we can go in and modify all of these things if we want. To do so, we just go up to the Setup menu and select which step you would like to modify. For example, if I want to change the stimulus parameters, I'll just go into Stimulus. So maybe I want to change the stimulus level to 500 millivolts and change the stop frequency of the sweep to 100 hertz instead of 50. Now, if I rerun my sequence, it'll have my new parameters. And I could go through and customize all of the limits and apply them directly to the device that I'm testing here. Once you've gone through and established all the different parameters that you want in this sequence, to save it, we just go up to Save As, and now we can make a new sequence based off the template. So as you can see, I already have a couple of custom sequences in here. Maybe I'll call this one Loudspeaker Model C. And I could go through and keep doing Save As and generate all these different test sequences for each model that I plan on testing. And when I call up one of these sequences from the menu here, it will be loaded with all the parameters that I've saved, all the stimulus parameters, limits, display, autosave, everything. So you can still have customized test sequences per model. When you're running SoundCheck 1, you still have access to the memory list, just like the full version of SoundCheck. So you can reopen data back into the memory list from disk, and then use the offline processing to do statistics, post-processing, generate reports. All of those offline functions are still available. In SoundCheck 13, we've introduced a new Preferences menu, which contains a lot of different functions that were split up before, and we've sort of consolidated them into one place. So it gives you a single location to set things like folder paths, which you just saw me go into to change which status.dat I was using. So you can set the status file location, you can set a default data directory, and a few other things. You can set the background color and the wallpaper if you wanted to customize the way the background of SoundCheck looks. And this is where we also can set passwords for the different login levels. So previously, login was its own separate entity that you had to go into to set passwords, and now that's all contained here in the Preferences menu. The Preferences menu can't be opened unless you're logged in as engineer, so there's no risk of operator or technician level users getting access to the password control. Also, many options that previously were only available in the INI file can now be set in Preferences. So rather than having to dig through this text-based file and editing it in Notepad and resaving it, now we have this simple graphical interface here to go in and set these preferences. Things like show sequence documentation. So if you've used SoundCheck and used any of our examples before, those are the PDFs that pop up when you load any of the SoundCheck sequences. You can enable or disable that, as well as the Quick Start menu. And you can even disable the login if you're not using it and have it not appear when you start SoundCheck. New Quick Start menus. We've revamped the Quick Start in SoundCheck 13 to provide an easy interface for choosing what you would like to do when SoundCheck first loads. For example, you can browse for a sequence, choose what sequence you'd like to load. You get a list of all the recently used sequences. So if you only use a small subset of sequences in SoundCheck regularly, you'll see them all populated in that list, and that provides an easy access to open one of them up. There's also a utility for viewing our example sequences that come with SoundCheck. I'll show you that. It gives you a little text that appears on the screen that gives you an idea about what the sequence does and gives you the option to view the sequence documentation. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to switch back to the full version of SoundCheck. The Quick Start menu is available in SoundCheck 1, but it really only lets you open sequences. It's a little bit more limited. So when you first launch SoundCheck, or if you want to open it later, you can get to it through the Help menu here. You will see the Quick Start menu. You have a button here to open, which will bring up a browse dialog and allow you to get to a sequence anywhere on your system. There's also a button here to click New to generate a brand new sequence. And then in this drop-down here, we'll see a list of all the sequences we have accessed recently. So you can keep track of which ones you've used and quickly get to any that have been opened recently in the past. Down here at the bottom is a button to link to our example sequences. So if you click that, you get the example sequence browser, which is broken down here by application. So if we open up one of the applications here, you'll see a list of all the sequences contained in there. And then as you select them, you will see some text here showing you information about what the sequence does. So you can scroll through here and get an idea about what these different examples are showing and choose what you'd like to look at. There's a button here to view the sequence document, which will open the PDF associated with that sequence. And then if you decide you'd like to use one of these sequences, simply double-click on it, and it will now open up in the SoundCheck, and you can run that example. In the past few versions of SoundCheck, we've introduced the capability to set various items to memory list values, basically making parameters in the sequence dynamic variables. Our latest one that we're introducing is the time window for the time selective response analysis step. So when we're doing the TSR measurements, we have a time gating that gets applied to the measurement. And previously, this had to be a hard-coded start and stop values saved in the analysis step. Well, now you have the option to switch that over to a memory list value, and that makes it dynamic. So one example would be, you could bring up the impulse response on screen for the user to view, and then bring up message prompts to ask what they would like the start and stop times of the window to be, and then feed those into the analysis step. Or if you wanted to fully automate it and make it assigned programmatically, you could even use some post-processing steps to decide how you would like the time window to be calculated, and then based on those parameters, feed those values into the time window. So this is a trend that will continue in SoundCheck. We want to provide more places where you can assign dynamic variables. It just makes the system so much more powerful and flexible to make the sequence do exactly what you would like it to do. Finally, in SoundCheck 13, we are introducing a new hardware key. So the hardware key, meaning our USB dongle that comes with SoundCheck that controls our licensing. So for a long time, we've used the Rocky hardware key, and now we're switching over to the Marks key. The main reason that we're switching to the Marks key is that the Rocky was not compatible with 64-bit applications, and it was high on our list to release a version of SoundCheck that was native to 64-bit, so that necessitated finding the new key. So the Marks key is compatible with 64-bit, so it'll be the same key regardless of which version you are using on your system. The other reason to implement this key is that it offers superior hardware protection, or software protection rather. So with us being a global software company, it's very important to us to maintain control and security over our product. And that was a big reason to move to the Marks key as well. One thing to know, if you will be upgrading from a previous version to SoundCheck 13, is that older versions of SoundCheck will not work with this new Marks key. So at some point, you'll need to completely switch over to the newer version. Now, we'll be providing a grace period for that to happen. You'll be getting your new Marks key once you decide to upgrade, and we'll give you some time to get everything ported over from your previous versions into SoundCheck 13, and then at some point, you'll need to send your old Rocky back to us at Listen. If you have any questions or concerns about this and the whole process, you can get in touch with your sales representative, and they'll be happy to talk about it with you and walk through the process. If you have an active support contract right now, you may have already received or will be receiving an email detailing this whole process and what needs to happen. So for now, I'm going to switch back over to our WebEx window. And I want to show you here a little bit of information about upgrading. So if you have a previous version of SoundCheck and are not currently on an active support contract, if you'd like to both upgrade and get back on a support contract, we're offering a temporary promotional upgrade price, as you can see here. If you scan through, find which version you currently have and see what the pricing structure is going to look like. If you need some information figuring out what version you're currently entitled to and what the upgrade cost will be, get in touch with your Listen sales associate, which you can do at sales@listeninc.com or by calling the Boston office. And if you provide your key numbers for your current SoundCheck licenses, they'll be able to look up your system information and generate a quote for you, let you know what it'll cost to upgrade to SoundCheck 13. So finally, just want to see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. You can type them into the Q&A box that you see there. Or if you think of anything later on that you'd like to ask us, feel free to email at sales or support@listeninc.com, either way. And last of all, I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today and learn about the SoundCheck 13 new features. We're always excited to release a new version of the product, and version 13 is, of course, no exception. So if no one has any questions, I will hang out here for a moment to answer anything you might have. And otherwise, again, thank you for coming, and everyone have a great weekend.